On the night of July 26, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling sat 1 kilometer from a German airfield in the Egyptian desert when every runway light suddenly blazed to life. 18 jeeps carrying 60 British and Free French commandos sat exposed under a full moon. A Luftwaffe bomber was beginning its landing approach. Stirling had seconds to decide: withdraw, and the intelligence went stale; drive forward, and 37 German aircraft would burn in 15 minutes. What happened in those seconds established the tactical doctrine that Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and every vehicular special operations unit would study for the next 8 decades. The Ministry of Defense classified the full details for years. American officers studied it in silence. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of the Sidi Haneish raid before today? Because what you are about to discover is not just about 18 jeeps destroying an airfield. It is about what happened when those runway lights came on, and what one man decided to do about it. Now let's go. To understand why Stirling was there at all, you must first understand the catastrophe unfolding 60 miles to the east. July 1st, 1942. The British 8th Army was 60 miles from losing Egypt. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had reached El Alamein, the last defensible position before Alexandria and the Suez Canal. If the line broke, the war changed irrevocably. The mathematics were simple and catastrophic. Rommel had captured Tobruk on June 21st. British forces had retreated so rapidly, they abandoned massive supply dumps. German units were now using captured British fuel and ammunition to advance toward the most strategically vital waterway on Earth. Control of the Suez Canal meant control of Allied supply routes to India, Asia, and the Middle East. Beyond the canal lay the Persian Gulf oil fields. If Germany reached those fields, the entire Allied war effort faced collapse. Rommel had a problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve: distance. The Afrika Korps had advanced over 500 miles in 6 weeks. Supply lines stretched across desert, where Allied air and naval forces destroyed 70% of everything the Axis attempted to ship across the Mediterranean. Roads were few and vulnerable to air attack. Rail lines ended hundreds of miles from the front. The solution was airlift. Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft ferried supplies, ammunition, medicine, and reinforcements to forward airfields scattered across the desert. These tri-motor cargo planes were invaluable and irreplaceable. Without them, Rommel's advance stalled regardless of how many battles he won. Each Ju-52 could carry 3 tons of supplies, or 18 fully equipped soldiers. Losing even one meant critical shortages at the front. Losing dozens meant operational paralysis. The First Battle of El Alamein began on July 1st and raged for 27 days. General Claude Auchinleck commanded British forces attempting to halt the German advance. Rommel attacked with confidence that momentum would carry him through the British defensive line and onto the Nile. His forces were exhausted. He knew it. He gambled that the British were more exhausted. On the first day of battle, the Afrika Korps began with 55 operational tanks. By evening, 37 remained. Yet the offensive pushed forward anyway, because stopping meant giving the British time to reinforce and resupply. Speed was everything, but speed required fuel and ammunition that had to be flown in by transport aircraft operating from airfields like Sidi Haneish. Sidi Hanesh sat 235 miles behind the front lines, near the coastal town of Fuka in northwestern Egypt. Allied reconnaissance flights identified it as a critical logistics hub hosting approximately 36 aircraft, including the precious Ju-52s. The location was lightly defended because German commanders assumed British forces could not reach it. Conventional ground operations required secure supply lines and overwhelming force. Air raids required diverting bombers from other targets and accepting losses to anti-aircraft defenses. Both approaches were resource-intensive and slow. What the British needed was something faster, cheaper, and more surgical. By late July 1942, they had it. Not artillery, not strategic bombing. 60 men and 18 jeeps who had learned to make the desert disappear. The concept belonged to a man whose aristocratic background suggested nothing about his capacity for controlled chaos. Lieutenant Colonel Sir Archibald David Stirling was born November 15, 1915, into a Scottish military family. His father had been a brigadier general. Stirling himself showed little interest in conventional military service, or conventional anything. Tall and athletically built, he was utterly undisciplined in peacetime. An inveterate gambler with a fondness for nightlife, he drifted through university without completing his studies. He trained to climb Mount Everest when war broke out, and immediately enlisted in the Scots Guards. He hated regimental discipline. The endless drill and parade ground formality suffocated him. He transferred to the commandos, seeking action, and found bureaucracy instead. In July 1941, while training for a parachute operation, Stirling's parachute malfunctioned. He hit the ground hard enough to injure his back and legs. While recovering in a Cairo hospital, confined to crutches, he conceived an idea that conventional military thinking had dismissed as impossible. Small teams of soldiers, dropped or driven behind enemy lines, could destroy more aircraft on the ground than bombers could destroy in the air. The concept was simple. Aircraft parked on desert airfields were vulnerable. Destroying them required only reaching them undetected and applying explosives or gunfire. No aerial dogfights, no bomber losses, no need to penetrate defended airspace, just insertion, destruction, and extraction. Stirling presented his proposal to senior commanders who were skeptical but desperate. North Africa was not going well. Conventional approaches were failing. The RAF was losing bombers faster than they could be replaced. Ground forces were being pushed back across territory they had paid for in blood. Something different was needed. In July 1941, Stirling received permission to form L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was deliberate deception. There was no parachute brigade in North Africa. The designation was meant to confuse German intelligence into believing the British had deployed airborne forces to the theater. 6 officers and 60 enlisted men, drawn from other formations, comprised the original unit. The first operation launched in November 1941. Operation Squatter was intended to demonstrate the concept. 55 men parachuted behind German lines to attack multiple airfields simultaneously. High winds scattered the force across miles of desert. Equipment was lost. Men landed in minefields or broke bones hitting rocky ground. Only 21 men reached the rendezvous point, where the long-range desert group was waiting to extract them. The operation was a disaster. Most commanders would have disbanded the unit. Stirling convinced his superiors to try again with a different insertion method. He understood what the British needed, even if conventional thinking could not see it yet. The war in the desert was being lost aircraft by aircraft, supply dump by supply dump, and the tools to reverse that loss were already in theater. They just needed someone willing to use them differently. Before the SAS could become raiders, they had to become nomads. The long-range desert group had been navigating the desert since 1940. Major Ralph Bagnold, Royal Engineers officer and pre-war explorer, had founded the unit to conduct reconnaissance across terrain the size of India. By 1941, LRDG patrols were covering 4,000 miles on single missions, reading tracks in featureless sand, navigating by sun and stars. When Stirling formed the SAS, he had soldiers who could fight. The LRDG taught them how to reach the fight and survive the return. The partnership was born of necessity, but proved transformative. LRDG navigators showed SAS operators how to read the desert, how to find water and country, where water decided who lived and who died, how to maintain vehicles in conditions that destroyed engines and transmissions within days if you did not understand what heat and sand did to metal. They taught them that the desert killed as surely as bullets if you did not respect it. Navigation by sun compass during daylight, navigation by stars at night. Reading vehicle tracks in sand to determine how many trucks had passed, how long ago, and where they were headed. These were skills that could not be taught in barracks or learned from manuals. They were earned through days and nights in terrain that forgave nothing. In December 1941, the LRDG transported SAS raiding parties to attack airfields at Tamat and Sirte. 24 aircraft were destroyed in those raids. Follow-on operations hit Ajdabiya and destroyed 37 more aircraft. Then, another raid at Tamat destroyed 27 additional aircraft. The concept was proven. Stirling's proposal, dismissed as impossible by conventional thinkers, had just destroyed 88 German aircraft in 3 operations. But the LRDG was a taxi service, not an assault force. For the SAS to reach its full potential, independence was necessary. They needed to insert themselves, conduct the raid, and extract themselves without relying on another unit's schedule or priorities. By spring 1942, the unit had acquired modified Willys Jeeps and learned to operate them across desert terrain without LRDG guidance. Student had surpassed teacher. Vehicles were stripped of windscreens to reduce silhouettes. Twin Vickers K machine guns were mounted on each Jeep, one forward and one rear-facing. The Vickers K was an aircraft weapon adapted for ground use, capable of firing over 1,000 rounds per minute. Loaded with tracer ammunition, these weapons could set fuel tanks ablaze from 100 meters. The visual effect was devastating. Streams of incendiary rounds arcing through darkness looked like science fiction brought to the Egyptian desert. Each Jeep carried jerry cans of fuel strapped to every available surface, water condensers to prevent radiator loss, spare tires, sand channels for getting unstuck, and enough supplies for week-long missions deep behind enemy lines. 3 or 4 men crewed each vehicle: driver, gunner, navigator, and sometimes a 4th man to handle demolitions or provide extra firepower. Navigation relied on sun compasses during daylight and stars at night. No headlights that could be seen for miles, no radio communication that could be intercepted and used to track their position. Just speed, firepower, and the ability to navigate across featureless terrain where temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit and water rations were limited to 6 pints per day. The Jeeps were not armored. They were not designed to survive sustained combat. They were designed to reach places conventional forces could not reach, deliver overwhelming firepower for a few minutes, and disappear before the enemy could organize a response. Speed was armor. Surprise was armor. The willingness to operate 200 miles behind enemy lines with no support and no rescue was armor of a different kind entirely. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who would later command the 8th Army to victory at El Alamein, made an assessment of Stirling that captured both the man and the unit he had created. Montgomery said the boy Stirling is quite mad, quite mad. However, in a war, there is often a place for mad people. By July 1942, Stirling commanded a force that had proven it could reach any airfield in the desert and vanish before dawn. What he lacked was someone who could execute with precision and controlled violence. He had found that person 18 months earlier. Paddy Mayne, Robert Blair. Mayne was born January 11th, 1915, in Newtownards, County Down, Northern Ireland. Towering and powerful, he was an international rugby player who had toured South Africa with the British and Irish Lions in 1938. He had studied law at Trinity College, Dublin. When war came, he joined the Royal Ulster Rifles, transferred to the commandos, and participated in the Litani River Raid in January 1941. Stirling recruited him for the SAS in July 1941 despite reservations about Mayne's temperament. Mayne had a reputation. Those who knew him described him as a man with inner fury, prone to violent outbursts, particularly when alcohol was involved. He had once torn the door off a vehicle with his bare hands during a rage. In combat, that fury became something else, focused, controlled, lethal. One of his gunners later said it was beautiful, in a terrible sort of way. That was Paddy Mayne's whole biography in a sentence. The man who could tear a door off its hinges in a bar, could walk through burning aircraft, placing demolition charges with the calm precision of a surgeon. The violence was there. The difference was where it got pointed and when. The SAS's first operation in November 1941 killed Mayne's close friend Ian McGonigal. The loss affected him deeply, but did not slow him. In December 1941, Mayne participated in the raids that destroyed 61 aircraft. In subsequent operations through spring and early summer 1942, he established himself as the unit's most effective operator. His method was distinctive. While others placed explosives and withdrew, Mayne often stayed to ensure complete destruction. He would walk among burning aircraft, placing additional charges, making certain that what burned stayed burned. On July 9, 1942, Mayne led a jeep-mounted raid on El Daba airfield and destroyed 14 aircraft. 2 nights later, he returned to Fuka airfield and destroyed 22 more. Germans and Italians were reeling. They knew British raiding forces existed, but could not defend every airfield simultaneously. Guard forces at one airfield meant fewer troops at the front. Luftwaffe commanders began diverting resources from frontline operations to guard supply bases. This was exactly what Stirling intended. Every German soldier guarding an airfield was a soldier not fighting at El Alamein. Every aircraft destroyed on the ground was one fewer aircraft supporting Rommel's advance. Every ton of supplies that did not reach the front was another ton the Afrika Korps would have to do without. The mathematics were simple. The SAS was forcing the Germans to make impossible choices: defend the rear and weaken the front, strengthen the front and lose the rear. There was no solution that did not cost them something they could not afford to lose. Between July 9th and July 26th, Allied reconnaissance identified that Sidi Haneish remained packed with aircraft, including the critical Ju-52 transports that kept the Afrika Korps supplied. Stirling looked at the intelligence photographs showing neat rows of aircraft parked in dispersal areas. He made his decision. One more raid, one more night, 37 more aircraft that would never fly again. 18 jeeps carrying 60 British and Free French commandos would depart from Bir el Qusair, a forward base 80 kilometers east of the target. The convoy would travel without headlights, navigating by moonlight and compass across terrain that looked identical in every direction. Arrival time would be shortly after midnight, when German personnel would be sleeping. 2 columns of 9 jeeps each would form a V-shape to maximize firepower coverage across the airfield. Once on the airfield, raiders would conduct systematic sweeps from one end to the other, firing Vickers K guns loaded with tracer ammunition at every aircraft they encountered. Speed and surprise would compensate for lack of armored protection. Withdrawal would occur before German forces could organize an effective response. The convoy would then split into smaller groups and navigate separately back to rendezvous points, hiding during daylight hours to avoid air attack. The risks were calculated and accepted. Detection during approach meant withdrawal was still possible. Detection during the assault meant the raiders would fight their way out or die trying. There was no middle ground. You either destroyed the airfield or you died on it. The plan did not include contingencies for partial success or tactical withdrawal under fire. The plan was total destruction or total commitment to achieving it. The moon would be full. This was both advantage and vulnerability. Visibility would be excellent for navigation and target identification. Drivers could see terrain features. Gunners could identify aircraft silhouettes, but visibility worked both ways. It would also be excellent for German sentries scanning the perimeter. There was debate about whether to postpone until a darker night when the moon was waning. Stirling rejected the suggestion. Intelligence was perishable. Every day that passed increased the likelihood that German defenses would be reinforced or aircraft relocated to other airfields. The photographs showed the targets were there now. Tomorrow they might not be. Full moon or not, the operation would proceed. The briefing at Bir el Qusair was short. Route reviewed. Timing confirmed. Weapons checked. Each man verified his ammunition load, water supply, and emergency extraction plan if separated from the main group. There were no speeches. There was no need for speeches. These men had done this before. They knew what worked and what got you killed. They knew that hesitation got you killed. They knew that equipment failure got you killed. They knew that bad navigation got you killed. They knew all the ways to die in the desert, and they had survived long enough to be sitting in this briefing, which meant they were either very good or very lucky. And luck in the desert ran out faster than water. Shortly after nightfall on July 26th, as the sun disappeared below the western horizon, 18 jeeps rolled out of Bir el Qusair, heading west into darkness. Desert at night transforms completely. Daytime heat that bakes metal until it burns skin gives way to cold that penetrates layers of clothing and chills bone. Moonlight illuminated rolling sand in shades of silver and black, creating an alien landscape that looked nothing like the same terrain in daylight. Formations were maintained by keeping visual contact with neighboring vehicles, each driver watching the jeep ahead and to the side. Engine noise was unavoidable, but less concerning than light discipline. No headlights that could be spotted from miles away. No cigarettes with their telltale orange glow. Radio silence absolute. Jeeps were cramped, designed for short trips, not extended missions. Weapons dug into ribs, ammunition boxes pressed against legs. Sand found its way into everything despite attempts to wrap equipment in cloth. These men were professionals, volunteers who had survived selection and training and multiple combat operations. They understood the stakes better than any briefing could convey. They were 235 miles behind enemy lines. If something went wrong, if vehicles broke down or they were detected, no rescue was coming. The LRDG had taught them desert navigation, but the LRDG was not coming on this mission. The SAS was operating independently now. Independence came with isolation. Success meant getting themselves in and getting themselves out. Failure meant death or capture. There was no radio call that would bring help. There was no air support on standby. There was no quick reaction force waiting to extract them if things went wrong. There were 18 jeeps, 60 men, and a desert that killed people who made mistakes. The 80-kilometer journey took hours of grinding progress across terrain that offered no roads, no landmarks, nothing but endless sand and occasional rock outcroppings. Navigation across featureless terrain required constant attention to compass bearings and terrain features that were barely visible even under the full moon. Temperature dropped as the night deepened. Wind carried sand across the formations, stinging exposed skin and forcing men to wrap scarves across their faces. Hands gripped steering wheels and weapons until knuckles ached. Eyes scanned the darkness for obstacles or enemy patrols. Psychological weight was as real as physical discomfort. Every kilometer deeper into enemy territory was another kilometer they would have to cover during withdrawal. Every minute closer to the target was another minute when detection could turn the mission into a running battle against superior forces. But the convoy encountered nothing. No patrols, no obstacles, no signs of human presence beyond their own vehicles. Empty desert was both reassuring and unsettling. Empty could mean the Germans were unaware. Empty could mean they were waiting. 1 kilometer from the airfield, Stirling raised his hand. The signal passed down the column. Engines idled to near silence. Men could hear wind across sand, the creak of cooling metal, their own breathing. This was the moment when everything could go wrong. If German patrols were out, they would be encountered now. Men checked weapons one final time. Magazines confirmed full. Safety switches confirmed off. Charges ready for placement on any aircraft that survived the initial gun runs. Then the runway lights came on. All of them. Bright white lights in 2 parallel lines, stretching across the darkness like a landing strip illuminated for incoming aircraft. Someone was landing. Germans did not know the SAS was there, or they did, and this was a trap. Seconds mattered. Withdraw now, and the opportunity was lost. German defenses would be reinforced. Aircraft would be relocated. The intelligence would go stale. Attack and risk driving into prepared defenses with machine guns aimed at the approach routes. Stirling made the read instantly. Lights were on for an incoming bomber, not because the raiders had been detected. The bomber landing meant distraction. German personnel would be focused on the aircraft touching down, not on the desert beyond the perimeter. Ground crews would be moving toward the runway. Sentries would be watching the approaching aircraft. Everyone's attention would be on that bomber for the next 60 seconds. Vulnerability could become advantage if they moved immediately. Stirling fired a green flare into the night sky. The signal was unmistakable. 18 Jeep engines rose from idle to a roar that shattered the silence. Formations moved forward, accelerating across open ground toward the runway lights. 2 columns, 9 Jeeps each. V formation spreading to maximize coverage. The German bomber touched down, rolled along the runway, began to slow. Its crew had no idea that behind them, 60 British and French commandos were driving onto their airfield with twin machine guns loaded and ready to fire. The moment the wheels touched down, those crew were already dead. They just did not know it yet. Vickers K guns opened fire. The sound was deafening. Tracer rounds arced across darkness in streams of light that looked almost beautiful if you ignored what they meant. Incendiary ammunition drawing lines of fire through the night air. Jeeps swept across the airfield in formation, right column firing at everything on the right, left column firing at everything on the left. There was no selectivity. There was no discrimination. Everything that looked like an aircraft got fire poured into it until it burned. Aircraft began exploding almost immediately. Fuel tanks ignited with booms that echoed across the desert. Ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions that sent debris spinning through the air. German troops scrambled from buildings, trying to understand what was happening, trying to locate the attackers. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the Jeeps were moving too fast, and gunners were shooting at sound and muzzle flashes rather than clear targets. Tracer fire going in both directions created a chaotic light show. One Jeep took hits and slowed, disabled but not destroyed. Its crew was pulled into another vehicle without stopping the assault. The formation pushed forward. Junkers Ju-52 transports burst into flames. These were the priority targets. Each one destroyed was 3 tons of supplies that would never reach Rommel's forces. Stuka dive bombers exploded as tracer rounds found fuel lines and ignited thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters were raked with gunfire that shredded control surfaces and ignited engines. The raiders made multiple passes across the parking areas, firing until magazines ran dry, reloading while moving, firing again. The systematic destruction took approximately 15 minutes from first shots to withdrawal order. Flames illuminated the entire airfield brighter than daylight. Smoke rose in columns that would be visible for miles. Air smelled of cordite and burning fuel, a combination that caught in the throat. Noise was overwhelming. Machine guns firing in sustained bursts. Explosions. German soldiers shouting, engines roaring. Paddy Mayne, even as other crews prepared to withdraw, drove his jeep alongside a bomber that had somehow remained intact through the chaos. He dismounted while his driver kept the engine running, placed an explosive charge in the engine nacelle, remounted, drove away. The bomb detonated seconds later, adding one more aircraft to the total. This was the difference between completing a mission and completing it thoroughly. Other men would have left that bomber. Mayne made sure it burned. 37 German aircraft were destroyed, or so damaged they would never fly again. Stirling gave the withdrawal order. Jeeps turned and accelerated back into darkness. Behind them, explosions persisted as fuel tanks cooked off and ammunition detonated. German soldiers were shouting, trying to organize a response, trying to mount a pursuit. But the raiders were already disappearing into the desert, their vehicles scattering in different directions. 15 minutes of destruction. Hours of escape awaited. Less than 2.5 hours of darkness remained before dawn. Dawn would expose the raiders to air attack from Stukas and Messerschmitts, based at other airfields. 18 jeeps split into smaller groups as planned, each taking different routes toward designated rendezvous points. This reduced the likelihood that German fighters could destroy the entire force if they located one group. It also meant each group was responsible for its own navigation and survival. No mutual support if one group encountered trouble. Largest groups had 4 or 5 jeeps. Smallest had 3. They scattered into the desert, navigating by stars, pushing their vehicles as fast as terrain allowed, while conserving enough fuel to reach safety. French units encountered problems almost immediately. Punctures from driving over sharp rocks. Mechanical breakdowns from engines, stressed beyond design limits. By the time the sun rose, they were still exposed in open desert with nowhere to hide. Stuka dive bombers found them. The first attack came without warning. Aircraft diving from altitude, sirens screaming, bombs falling. Jeeps scattered, but there was limited cover in flat desert. Stukas made multiple passes. 9 separate attacks over the course of hours. Each pass brought bombs and machine gun fire. Aspirant André Zernheld was killed in one of these attacks. 2 jeeps were destroyed, turned into twisted burning metal. Surviving French personnel pressed on by foot and in the remaining vehicle, eventually reaching Allied lines days later after an ordeal that left them dehydrated and sunburned. Lance Bombardier John Robson, a British soldier, was also killed, though accounts differ on whether he died during the assault at the airfield or the withdrawal. Other groups reached their rendezvous points successfully by staying hidden during daylight and moving only at night. By afternoon of July 27th, most of the raiders had reached safety at Bir el Kusir, or Karet Tartura, on the edge of the Katara Depression. They counted personnel and equipment. 2 dead. 3 jeeps destroyed. 37 German aircraft destroyed. The mathematics were brutal but clear. The operation was judged a success. The SAS had proven that jeep-mounted raids could achieve effects out of proportion to the size of the force employed. 2 men and 3 vehicles for 37 aircraft was a ratio no conventional operation could match. Bomber raids to destroy 37 aircraft would have cost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of crew. Ground assaults to capture the airfield would have required thousands of soldiers and weeks of preparation. 60 men and 18 jeeps had done it in one night. Stirling began planning the next operation immediately. There would be no pause for mourning. There was no time for mourning. The war was still being fought 60 miles away, and Rommel was still trying to reach the canal. The methodology developed over 18 months and validated at Sidi Haneish became doctrine that would be studied for generations. Small teams, mobile firepower, speed over sustainability, strike and vanish. The principles were simple. but their execution required training, courage, and acceptance of risk that conventional forces would never accept. Strategic impact was immediate and cumulative. Rommel's supply crisis deepened dramatically. Loss of Ju-52 transports was catastrophic for Axis logistics. Airlifting supplies to forward units became more difficult with every aircraft destroyed. German commanders were forced to divert combat troops to guard airfields against future raids. Entire companies of infantry that should have been fighting at El Alamein were instead manning perimeter defenses at rear area installations. Luftwaffe personnel, who should have been maintaining and flying aircraft, were instead digging trenches and filling sandbags. Resources that should have been supporting the offensive at El Alamein were redirected to protecting assets that might never be attacked. The uncertainty was as damaging as the actual raids. The Germans had to defend everywhere because they could not predict where the SAS would strike next. Stirling had turned their entire rear area into a liability. Every airfield, every supply dump, every fuel depot. All of them were now potential targets, and the Germans did not have enough soldiers to guard all of them. The First Battle of El Alamein ended on July 27th, with Rommel's advance halted. Multiple factors contributed to that outcome. British defensive positions were strong. German logistics were strained. Air superiority had shifted toward the Allies. Among those factors was the systematic destruction of Axis air capability by SAS raids. Sidi Haneish destroyed 37 aircraft in a single night. The number was verified by reconnaissance flights the following day. Smoke was still rising from the airfield, but strategic impact extended beyond one operation. Between the formation of the SAS in July 1941 and Stirling's capture in January 1943, the unit destroyed over 250 aircraft on the ground across dozens of raids. Sidi Haneish was the largest single-night success, but it was part of a cumulative campaign that devastated Luftwaffe capabilities in North Africa more effectively than Royal Air Force air-to-air combat during the same period. German fighters shot down in dogfights could be replaced more easily than transport aircraft destroyed on the ground, along with the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts they had been carrying. Every Ju-52 that burned at Sidi Hanesh was one fewer aircraft available to keep Rommel supplied during the critical autumn months when the Second Battle of El Alamein would decide North Africa's fate. The mathematics were undeniable. The SAS had changed the equation of the Desert War. Field Marshal Montgomery, who replaced Auchinleck as 8th Army commander in August 1942, inherited an improved strategic situation, partly because of what Stirling's raiders had accomplished. The assessment that Stirling was quite mad but useful was proven correct in measurable terms. In September 1942, Stirling was promoted to lieutenant colonel in recognition of his achievements. The SAS was expanded and reorganized as 1st SAS Regiment with multiple squadrons. Operations accelerated through autumn and winter. More airfields attacked, more supply dumps destroyed, more raids that forced the Germans to allocate resources to rear area security rather than frontline combat. Stirling himself led operations until January 1943, when he was captured in Tunisia during a reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines. Germans celebrated his capture. Stirling had become known among Axis forces as the Phantom Major for his ability to strike and disappear. His capture seemed to signal the end of the SAS and the tactics that had proven so effective. The unit did not disband. Paddy Mayne took command of what became the Special Raiding Squadron, and operations carried forward without interruption. Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, Germany. The SAS fought through every campaign until the end of the war. Mayne was awarded 4 Distinguished Service Orders, a tally second only to Stirling among SAS members. Many believed he deserved the Victoria Cross for actions that exceeded the requirements for Britain's highest military decoration, but the award was never made. Reasons remain debated decades later. Some argue his indiscipline and violent reputation worked against him in an officer corps that valued conformity. Others suggest that special operations, conducted in secrecy without witnesses outside the unit, did not receive the same recognition as conventional combat, witnessed by entire battalions. Regardless of medals or recognition, Mayne's operational record spoke for itself. He commanded British Special Forces through some of the most intense combat of the European campaign, and survived when so many did not. The Long-Range Desert Group, which had mentored the SAS and enabled their early operations, was disbanded in August 1945. The unit's reconnaissance missions in Greece, Yugoslavia, and Italy during the final years of the war had proven valuable. But post-war military planners saw no role for desert specialists in a world without desert wars. The LRDG's request to transfer to the Pacific Theater and engage Japanese forces was denied. War ended. The unit that had pioneered long-range reconnaissance and taught the SAS how to navigate the desert ceased to exist. The SAS itself was disbanded in October 1945. Politicians and senior military officers viewed special forces as wartime expedients, unnecessary in peacetime. That decision lasted less than 2 years. In 1947, rising Cold War tensions and insurgencies in Malaya and elsewhere convinced British planners that a permanent special operations capability was needed. The SAS was reformed and has operated continuously since, deployed to every conflict Britain has engaged in. The lesson had been learned. Special forces were not a wartime luxury. They were a permanent necessity. David Stirling spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. He made 4 escape attempts from various camps before being sent to Colditz Castle, the supposedly escape-proof facility for recalcitrant Allied prisoners. He remained there until May 1945, when Allied forces liberated the castle. After the war, Stirling settled in Rhodesia and founded the Capricorn Africa Society, an organization that promoted racial cooperation in Africa through limited voting franchises rather than universal suffrage. The approach attracted criticism from both sides of the racial divide. Later, Stirling formed private military companies and was linked to a failed attempt to overthrow Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in the early 1970s. His post-war activities remained controversial until his death. In 1990, months before his death, Stirling was knighted for services to the military. He died on November 4, 1990, aged 74. The man who had driven onto German airfields under a full moon died in a hospital bed in London, surrounded by family, far from the desert that had made him a legend. Paddy Mayne left the military after the war and returned to Northern Ireland. He worked as a solicitor and struggled with civilian life in ways common among men who had spent years in constant combat. The transition from war to peace was harder than any battle. The skills that kept you alive in the desert, the aggression and the fury and the willingness to walk into fire, those skills had no place in peacetime Northern Ireland. On December 14, 1955, Mayne was killed in a car accident near his home. He was 40 years old. Circumstances were never fully explained. Some believe he fell asleep at the wheel after a night of drinking. Others suggest mechanical failure. The details matter less than the loss. One of Britain's most decorated soldiers of the Second World War died on a rural road in peacetime, his wartime achievements known to few outside the special operations community. His grave is in Northern Ireland. The inscription is simple. The legend is not. John Robson and André Zernheld, the 2 men killed during or immediately after the Sidi Haneish raid, are buried in military cemeteries. Their families know where. The rest of the world largely does not. This is characteristic of special operations. Missions become public decades later. Participants often remain anonymous. Tactical innovations and strategic impacts are studied in staff colleges. Names of those who executed the operations and died doing so are recorded in regimental histories that few people outside military circles ever read. Robson and Zernheld were professional soldiers who volunteered for high-risk operations knowing the consequences. They died doing what they had trained to do. The raid succeeded because men like them were willing to drive jeeps onto a lit airfield under a full moon and accept whatever happened next. Their deaths were not meaningless. Their deaths were the price of 37 German aircraft that would never bomb another British position, never fly another ton of supplies to Rommel's forces, never contribute another sortie to the Axis war effort. The mathematics were brutal. The mathematics were also accurate. Americans were not present at Sidi Haneish. In July 1942, United States forces were still preparing for their first major operation in the European theater. Operation Torch, the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria, would not begin until November. American ground forces would not engage Axis troops in significant numbers until 1943. But American military observers and historians studied British special operations with intense interest. After the war, as the United States developed its own special forces capabilities, British methods became templates. The Special Air Service provided the model for what American special operations could achieve. Colonel Charles Beckwith served as an exchange officer with the SAS in the 1960s during counterinsurgency operations in Malaya. He returned to the United States, convinced that the American military needed a unit with similar capabilities. Beckwith spent years advocating for an SAS-style organization within the United States Army. His proposals were rejected repeatedly by senior officers who could not envision how such a unit would fit into American military doctrine. Conventional military culture resisted the idea of small, elite units operating with significant autonomy outside the normal chain of command. Vietnam and subsequent operations revealed gaps in American special operations capabilities. Hostage rescue situations where conventional forces were too large and too slow. Direct action missions against high-value targets that required precision. Operations requiring speed and surprise rather than overwhelming force. In November 1977, after years of advocacy, Beckwith received approval to form 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, commonly known as Delta Force. The unit was explicitly modeled on the SAS. Selection, training, operational methods, even organizational structure drew directly from British precedents that traced back to the Desert War. Beckwith had watched the SAS operate. He had seen what small teams with proper training and equipment could accomplish. He brought that knowledge back to the United States and built Delta Force on the foundation Stirling and Mayne had established 35 years earlier in the Egyptian desert. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, was formed in 1980 as a maritime counter-terrorism unit modeled on the British Special Boat Service, the naval equivalent of the SAS. Both units trace doctrinal lineage to methods developed in North Africa during World War II. Small teams. Overwhelming firepower concentrated at decisive points. Speed and surprise prioritized over numerical superiority. Operations conducted at night whenever possible. Independence from conventional support structures. These principles, proven at Sidi Haneish and refined through subsequent operations across multiple theaters, became foundational to modern American special operations. The doctrine did not change because the doctrine worked. 82 years after Stirling fired that green flare, American Special Forces operators are still being taught the lessons of Sidi Hanesh. The technology has changed. The principles have not. In training centers from Fort Bragg to Dam Neck, instructors teach Sidi Haneish as a case study in effective special operations. The operation demonstrates principles that remain valid 8 decades later. Small forces multiplied by mobility and surprise can achieve effects out of proportion to their size. Speed protects better than armor. Audacity succeeds where caution fails. Specific technology changes with each generation. Jeeps become mine-resistant ambush, protected vehicles. Vickers K guns become M240B machine guns. Night vision devices replace moonlight for navigation. Satellite communications replace radio silence. But the doctrine remains unchanged at its core. 18 Jeeps destroying 37 aircraft in 15 minutes under a full moon established the template that every vehicular special operations unit has followed since. American operators learned it by studying British operations in North Africa. So did every other nation that developed vehicular special operations capability. The Russians studied it. The Israelis studied it. The Australians studied it. The playbook was written in the Egyptian desert in July 1942, and it has not been rewritten because no one has found a better way to do what Stirling and Mayne did that night. 82 years after runway lights blazed at Sidi Haneish, the operation remains classified in many details, but legendary in its impact on military doctrine. 60 men and 18 Jeeps drove onto a German airfield under a full moon and destroyed 37 aircraft in 15 minutes. 2 died doing it. The mathematics were brutal. The achievement was extraordinary. Lance Bombardier John Robson and aspirant Andre Zernheld are buried in cemeteries, whose locations are known to their families and records offices. The wounded scattered to different lives. Survivors aged into old men carrying memories they could not fully share. Most are dead now. The last veterans of the original SAS are gone. The men who drove those Jeeps, who fired those guns, who watched those aircraft burn, they are all dead. The institutional memory has passed from lived experience to historical record. But the lessons remain. The doctrine remains. The understanding that small teams operating with speed and surprise can achieve what large formations cannot. That understanding remains embedded in every Special Forces unit that traces its lineage back to the Desert War. Americans watched in silence because what they were watching was the future of their own special operations. They studied Sidi Hanesh not because they doubted it happened, but because they wanted to understand how it happened and how they could replicate it. They built Delta Force on the foundation Stirling and Mayne established. They adopted the doctrine. They learned the methodology. The silence was not skepticism. The silence was respect. The silence was the sound of professionals recognizing other professionals and understanding that what had been accomplished in the Egyptian desert was not luck. It was skill applied with precision under conditions that forgave nothing. If you believe the story of 60 men rewriting Special Forces doctrine in 15 minutes deserves to be remembered, leave a comment below. Because the history of Sidi Hanesh cannot compel your attention on its own. Nothing is stopping you from moving on. But if you stay, if you share this, if you tell someone else that this happened, then the 2 men who died getting those Jeeps out of the desert are remembered for something other than the line in a casualty report that their families received in 1942. And if you want to understand how the same principles of speed, surprise, and audacity continue to shape how modern special forces operate in conflicts most of us will never hear about, watch this next. Because this is not the only time that impossible odds and 18 vehicles change the course of a war. The pattern runs considerably further than 1942. The doctrine established at Sidi Hanesh is still being applied today, in places you will never hear about, by people whose names you will never know, achieving results that will remain classified for decades. Runway lights came on at Sidi Haneish. 60 men decided to drive forward anyway. That decision changed special operations warfare forever. The decision was made in seconds. The consequences have lasted 82 years and counting.